Right, I'm Patrick Node. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of History.
My name is Camilla Leonard and I am a lecturer in the History Department.
My name is Angela Ellis and I'm an instructor of history at the University at Albany. Briefly, Eleanor of Aquitaine was an important aristocratic woman in the 12th century in Western Europe. She was in her own right the Duchess of Aquitaine, which is a province that is now in France.
Eleanor of Aquitaine was, she was the Queen of France and the Queen of England.
She had an excellent education. Her father, Duke William X of Aquitaine, was a poet, and he valued literature and learning, so he made sure that she got the sort of education that an aristocratic girl of her time and place would get.
Yes, I mean, she had a probably a better education than most aristocratic women because she could read. She could read Latin, and she could read the Provençal, the sort of vernacular language of poetry. So she was more educated, I would say, than the average aristocratic woman.
Yes, what happens is that her father, before he dies, makes out a will saying that if anything happens to him, that his oldest daughter, Eleanor, should become a ward of the King of France. And he does this because he knows exactly how vulnerable she's going to be without a father. Once she comes into her inheritance, every ambitious nobleman is going to try to kidnap and rape her in order to force her into marriage and gain control of Aquitaine.
Okay, so our first marriage was to Louis VII of France, who was obviously keen to incorporate this part of southern France into the kingdom, and so the idea, however, was that Eleanor would keep her dowry. Her dowry was Aquitaine.
They were, yes, and Louis was not intended originally for the throne. He had an older brother named Philip who dies, and the plan had been that Philip would be king and Louis would be devoted to the church, and he would be able to be his brother's ecclesiastical ally. But when his brother dies, that plan is interrupted, and after being raised to be a celibate churchman, all of a sudden he has to be king and he has to be married, and on top of that, he has to be married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, of all women, and it seemed to be a little much for him.
As it happened, after I think about 10 years of marriage, or maybe a little longer, she only bore daughters.
Yes, it was rocky for a number of reasons. Again, Louis had been raised to be a celibate churchman and wasn't quite sure what to do with a wife, particularly a wife as vivacious and beautiful and outgoing as Eleanor of Aquitaine. They also had political disputes, but what really did them in was the fact that she never produced a son.
And the King of France, desperately wanted a heir, so in fact he, strove to extract himself from the marriage. It doesn't seem they got along to boot, that they weren't kind of a match made in heaven. And so the marriage was annulled on grounds of consanguinity, on grounds that they were actually related. And so that marriage ended.
Well, she immediately starts plotting, because she knows she is not safe as a woman on her own, that there are noblemen literally lying in wait to kidnap her and force her into a marriage. And she decides that the ideal husband for her is the future Henry II of England. And she gets in touch with him and says, we should really join forces here.
Well, I mean, I think that they were the obvious person, right? If you have been married to the King of France, only the King of England would be an obvious person, and of course Henry II was very keen to have her. So now you have to remember that although he's the King of England, he is also the Count of Anjou. I mean, so that is really a direct neighbor. So on the one hand, the King of France is even sort of more distant than the Angevins were of the sort of the territorial homeland of Henry II. So in point of fact, it's not that big of a jump. right? It's not Henry II, in fact, spent more time in France than he did in England.
She manages to live until she's roughly 82 years old. And even though she's already been married before and is not a young virgin bride when she joins forces with the future Henry II, she goes on to have at least 8 children with him. Yes, it's 5 sons, it's 3 daughters. A number of the children predecease her and Henry II, but the most important of the sons are Richard the Lionheart and King John.
They got along, yeah. I mean, at the beginning, I think there was genuine affection, but when she was pregnant with John, who I don't think he's the youngest, but he's far along in the sequence. Henry I then takes a mistress named Rosamund Clifford, and that caused a break in their relationship because, and it said that Henry spent most of his time at a place called Woodstock, which is outside Oxford. He had a kind of royal residence there, a hunting lodge, and John wasn't born at Woodstock, and people say that he wasn't born at Woodstock because Henry was there with his mistress, and so that caused a big problem, and the mistress, eventually, I think she's forced to go into a nunnery. And then once the children grow up and the various sons, want their inheritance, Eleanor sides with her sons against Henry. So that, at several points, the sons of Henry II rebel against him, and the mother, sides with the son. In a sense, I think she's different from a lot of these women because she actually has her power or her importance. It stems from herself and who she is. It's not that she's, she does later on derive status from being the mother of kings, but that's not really fundamentally what she's about. She's just an extremely rich woman, and also a personality and an educated woman, and that's why she's important. Whereas a lot of other women, that they act on behalf of their young son, but that's not the case with Eleanor.
Eventually, she retreats to a convent in France, but not before crossing the Pyrenees to gather one of her granddaughters to marry her off strategically. So she's not only living to be in her 80s, it's a really vigorous 80s that I guess she gets the satisfaction in the end of having outlived everyone who tried to constrain her. Well, I think we do have to be careful not to look at her as a feminist hero. As we've talked about before, feminism is just not a concept that exists in the 12th or 13th century in Europe. It would have been totally foreign to her. She's very, very competent, but at the end of the day, everything is mediated through some male relative, and there's really nothing that can be done about that.
Well, Isabella France was the daughter of Philip the Fair, who was king of France at the beginning of the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, and at this point of time, Philip the Fair was at war with England, with Edward I of England, and part of the peace treaty was that the son of Edward I was to be married to the daughter of the King of France, and this would cement a union and hopefully prevent wars from breaking out. It was occupied with his own things, and so, it's talked about at their wedding. He didn't sit with his bride, he sat with his friend Piers Gaveston, and showered much more attention on Piers Gaveston than he did on his wife. And at one point even I think giving some of the jewels of his wife to Piers. And so the relationship was never very close between the two. Edward II was not politically savvy as his father. He had friends, he wanted to spend time with his friends, he wanted lavish gifts on his friends, and he didn't cultivate the nobility, and he didn't really cultivate his wife. Yes, I mean, absolutely. She certainly had a sense of herself and that she was important. I believe she too could read. And the Capetians were the last capuchins in particular were very, very religious. Well, I don't know. I think that it's one of those things that, rebellion against the king, even when it's necessary, there always has to be like a fall guy or somebody to blame. And I think that the blame is sometimes put on her for the rebellion. But I mean, I think it was clear that with the support that she gained, that it was I wouldn't say necessary, but people understood it, and so the nobility really was fed up with Edward II, and so she was able to capitalize on that discontent in her rebellion against him. At that point, she was also the mother of a king-to-be, so Edward III was going to be king, and so there's also the element of acting on his behalf in a way, of getting rid of one king and preparing the way for a new one. Of course, there's much talk about she had this affair with Mortimer, and the two of them were an item, and it's both of them who rebelled against Edward. And then Mortimer becomes the fall guy for that. She doesn't really, she's called the she-wolf of France, but Mortimer is executed effectively by Edward III for rebelling against the king, because you can rebel against the king, but there has to be consequences because you don't want that to be a precedent. She doesn't. She doesn't really suffer. She's allowed to live, and she's not put into a nunnery or anything like that. She has a retinue. She has her court. She may be held at a bit arm's length by Edward III. She's not so influential, but at the same time, she doesn't suffer. Yes, she acted as regent, and then once he assumed kingship or took the throne, then she was kept at arm's length. And the other thing about it is that what's quite interesting is that she goes on this affair with Mortimer, and her sisters in France, they had also committed adultery or infidelity, and they had been imprisoned for it. So it's one of those things that Philip the Fair was very severe on the conduct of his daughters, and so to some extent it was certainly a risk. In England, she's a scapegoat, but I would be interested to look at French portrayals of her. I don't know if you've ever seen there's a French miniseries called Les Rois Maudits. It's about the last years of the Capetians, and there's two versions of it. One was done in the 1960s, and one was done maybe 2008 with Gérard Depardieu and others, and they updated it. But in those depictions, I think she's portrayed sympathetically as being with an impossible husband. I think it's a fantastically interesting time period, the beginning of the 14th century, and she's part of a chessboard. It's fascinating to look at with the Templars in the beginning of the 100 Years' War, and it's just a very, very interesting time.
Very powerful person, a very well-known character in history, a very powerful woman, a queen of France, and then afterwards she played an important role in the life of her three sons who reigned on the throne of France. She was born in Florence, and she was highly educated. Both her parents were very much interested in her education, and she loved to learn. She was highly knowledgeable, she spoke languages, she was interested in art, and she was also passionate by, very interested in cuisine. She introduced a lot of newly discovered vegetables from the Americas, or also she loved to cook, she loved to experience with food, and she was very, I'd say, courageous also in the way she planned her meals. I don't think so that she hoped for that, because she was not part of the, as the French say, crème de la crème, the highest level of aristocracy, and she was a foreigner for the French, and she came from Florence. I don't think so. It just happened that she became the Queen of France, even though she was so young. She was 14. I think what I know is that mostly people from the court of France were looking for a wife for their soon-to-be king, And this is how she married Henry II. Well, they started liking each other. It was first a successful marriage. When they got married, it was a big event for the whole France and the court. And it was destined to be successful. The only problem is that her husband was not in love with her. And he was very devoted to his long-time mistress, Diane de Poitiers. But before Diane, he had other mistresses. The problem is that she couldn't conceive. She couldn't have a child for 10 years within their marriage. After she did a lot of things, I mean, she knew that it was a big pressure on her. I think nowadays a psychologist or a doctor or people who would look more into her emotional life would say that actually she couldn't conceive not because she had some physical problems, but maybe because of the stress of having an unfaithful husband, the pressure of having a kid. Not always very friendly French court. Finally was treated by a new doctor. I can't remember his name at this point. She conceived 9 kids actually. Yeah, this is what they say, and she was blamed so much. She opens, I mean, I don't know if you remember from your history classes that whenever a queen of France was a foreigner and having an accent like Marie Antoinette, she was blamed for all the problems. I mean, it was a fashion of blaming women. It was not visible. I would call Catherine de Medici a late bloomer, as a politician, as a patron of the arts. What happened to him, Henry II? He was just 40. During that time, it was an old age. I mean, not quite old, but definitely an advanced. It was a court fair, and he was playing sports with his fellow aristocrats, also interested in this, medieval sports for men, and he was wounded. I think she discovered her pleasure for politics and political life, and she was such an intelligent woman. And for a lot of the problems France had during that time, she had good solutions. She knew that her role as a regent was just secondary, but she hoped to make it more, to have a more, to have a say during that time, and to make it more complex. I wanted to see richer, because she would get allies at the court with a lot, because I'm saying not one or two. She would know how to play the court politics. She knew people by then. She knew who liked whom, and then Catherine de Medici, like her predecessor, would be very able to, become a very, very strong, very articulate political figure. During the reign of her 3 sons, because she had she was, the mother of 3 kings of France, one after another, they were brothers. She had the various levels of power during their reign. I'd say that she had a constructive relationship, maybe with Charles, up to a point, but of course that these young men, even positive, they loved their mother and they respected their power, they also belonged to the high circle of politics, and also they were influenced by other people who sometimes were haters. That no, she was falling out of power. And actually, I don't know if you remember that I said that in my Women in Europe class, that we have Jardin du Luxembourg because Catherine de Medici, the day her husband died, built for herself a castle, another one than Louvre. It's, I would say, almost a walking distance from the Luxembourg Castle Palace, because it was a palace, to Louvre, because not only that Catherine de Medici has a statue, but other powerful women have like this walk of fame with statues of very, very important women, but hers is the main statue. It was a sexy society, a very sexy society. Men and women sometimes didn't like powerful queens. Maybe the court of England was an exception, even though Elizabeth I and later on other women queens also had problems. It was a sexy society, and as I said, I think again, I would like to reinforce that idea of finding scapegoats throughout history. History was made and written by men until more recently. But for men historians to blame women for the wrongdoings in history, if we look at the way we present the news, it has to be very, powerful, and the way you remember how Catherine the Great, the German-Russian empress, was presented, also in this sensational, very dark nuances and shades, and at least Catherine de' Medici escaped the sexualization of her image. A lot of the sexual innuendos were endless. In the way, I think she didn't hesitate to push the boundaries. She didn't hesitate to get out of the domestic sphere, which was the only one and only possible for women, and she didn't hesitate to do politics and to make politics. And I think she was courageous, innovative, a human with her flaws, but definitely a character, an important image, and an inspiration for other women politicians, because, a lot was written during her time and afterwards about her. Catherine, in a way, history revenged her. After she was buried at Blois, the French took her remains and she was moved in the Cathedral of the Kings and Queens.